The story of the ancient Hebrews begins in the cradle of civilization, in a land where mighty rivers carved fertile valleys and great kingdoms rose and fell. The world of the second millennium before our era was one of movement, trade, and shifting. Peoples to the east stretched Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, home to the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. To the west lay Canaan, the land that linked Asia with Africa, a place of caravans, ports, and fertile plains. This region was a bridge between mighty empires and a home for countless small tribes. In this crossroads of cultures, a people emerged whose story would echo through time. The Hebrews began not as kings or conquerors, but as wanderers. Their earliest memory reaches back to a single man, Abraham, who lived in the bustling city of Ur in Mesopotamia. According to tradition, Abraham received a divine call. He was told to leave his home, his father's household, and the familiar safety of the city to journey toward an unknown land. In exchange for this obedience, a covenant was given to him. A covenant was more than a promise. It was a binding relationship, a sacred agreement. Abraham was told that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the night sky, that they would inherit a land of their own, and that through them all nations would be blessed. Abraham's journey from Ur to Canaan was not a simple migration, but a step of faith. He traveled with his family, his servants, and his herds, moving as nomads under the wide skies. The path took him through deserts and oases, past cities guarded by walls and temples. Yet his heart was set on a land he had not yet seen. In Canaan, he built altars and offered prayers, marking the soil with acts of devotion. The Hebrews would later look back to this journey as the beginning of their unique identity. They were not simply settlers of a land, but a people bound to their God through a covenant that would define their destiny. From Abraham came Isaac, the child of promise, born when Abraham and his wife Sarah were already old. Isaac's life was quieter, a bridge between the great beginning of Abraham and the dramatic life of his son Jacob. Jacob, later given the name Israel, became the father of 12 sons. These sons would give their names to the 12 tribes of Israel, each carrying forward a part of the family's legacy. The stories of these patriarchs are filled with struggles, rivalries, and reconciliations. Jacob himself wrestled through the night with a mysterious figure and received both a wound and a blessing. His sons quarreled among themselves, selling their brother Joseph into slavery in Egypt. Yet later they were reunited in forgiveness. These tales were not only memories of ancestors, but also lessons of endurance, faith, and human frailty. The Hebrews of this early period were a small and vulnerable group. They lived as pastoral nomads, moving with the seasons, seeking water and pasture for their flocks. In a world dominated by powerful empires and fortified cities, they seemed insignificant. Yet their identity did not rest on wealth or military might. It rested on the belief that they had been chosen by a God unlike the many gods of their neighbors. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, temples rose to the sun, the moon, and the stars, to gods of storm and fertility. The Hebrews, however, cherished a different vision. Their God was not tied to a single place, statue, or temple. He was a living presence who traveled with them in their tents and across deserts. This was a radical idea in the ancient world, and it gave them a sense of uniqueness that bound them together. Their culture in this period was simple, yet it carried seeds of lasting traditions. They passed their history and beliefs through oral storytelling, gathering families around fires to hear tales of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These stories explained who they were and why they mattered. They recalled the covenant and the promises given to their ancestors, reminding each generation that they were part of something larger than themselves. Rituals of sacrifice, prayers, and festivals began to take shape, setting them apart from neighboring peoples. As the Hebrews wandered between Mesopotamia and Canaan, they were both part of the ancient world and yet distinct from it. They traded with others, lived among Canaanite towns, and at times adopted local customs. But at their core, they maintained an identity shaped by memory, covenant, and faith. This identity would sustain them through trials that lay ahead. Out of their humble beginnings as a family of wanderers would rise a nation whose story has never been forgotten. The story of the Hebrews continues in Egypt, where a single family became a growing people. It began with Joseph, the beloved son of Jacob, who was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery. Through hardship and trial, Joseph rose to prominence in Egypt, using his wisdom to interpret dreams and guide the Pharaoh through years of famine. His foresight saved not only the Egyptians, but also his own family, who came seeking food in a time of hunger. Jacob and his sons settled in Egypt, where they found refuge and security. Generations passed, and the Hebrews multiplied. What had begun as a small family now became a community of thousands. At first they were welcomed, but over time, fear and suspicion grew among the Egyptians. A new pharaoh arose who did not remember Joseph, and he saw the Hebrews not as guests, but as a threat. He enslaved them, forcing them into hard labor, building cities, and working in the fields. Their lives became marked by suffering, and their cries for deliverance rose into the heavens. In this time of oppression, a child was born who would change their destiny. His name was Moses. Pharaoh had ordered that every Hebrew boy be killed at birth, but Moses' mother placed him in a basket and set him upon the Nile, trusting that God would protect him. The infant was found by Pharaoh's daughter, who raised him in the royal household as her own. Moses grew up surrounded by Egyptian learning and power, yet he never forgot his people. One day, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave and, in anger, struck the man down. Fleeing for his life, Moses escaped into the wilderness, where he lived as a shepherd far from the courts of Egypt. It was there, in the solitude of the desert, that Moses encountered the presence of God in a burning bush that blazed with fire yet was not consumed. From that moment his life was changed. God called him to return to Egypt and to lead his people out of bondage. Though hesitant and fearful, Moses accepted the call, strengthened by the promise that he would not walk alone. Moses returned to Egypt and stood before Pharaoh, demanding that the Hebrews be set free. Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he refused. Then came the plagues, each one a sign of divine power against the might of Egypt. The river turned to blood, frogs covered the land, hail fell from the skies, and darkness shrouded the land. Each time, Pharaoh resisted, and each time the suffering grew. Finally, on the night of the Passover, the Hebrews were told to mark their doors with the blood of a lamb, so that death would pass over their households. That night the firstborn sons of Egypt perished, and the cries of grief filled the land. Pharaoh, broken at last, ordered the Hebrews to leave Dot. In haste they gathered their belongings, their herds, and their children, and they set out into the wilderness. Yet Pharaoh's heart hardened once more, and he pursued them with his army. Trapped between the sea and the chariots, the people despaired. But Moses raised his staff, and the waters parted. The Hebrews crossed on dry ground, while the Egyptians who followed were swept away as the sea closed upon them. With this dramatic deliverance, the Hebrews were free. Their journey through the wilderness was long and filled with hardship. They faced hunger, thirst, and doubt, yet they were sustained by manna from heaven and water from the rock. At Mount Sinai, they gathered at the foot of the mountain, where thunder and fire filled the sky. There Moses received the 10 Commandments, written on tablets of stone. These were more than laws. They were the foundation of a covenant between God and his people. They set forth principles of worship, justice, and community that would guide them for generations. In addition to the commandments, instructions were given for the building of the tabernacle, a sacred tent where the presence of God would dwell. Among the people, at its heart was the Ark of the Covenant, a chest that held the stone tablets and became the most holy object in Hebrew faith. Wherever the Hebrews traveled, the Ark was carried before them, a symbol of divine guidance and protection. The years in the wilderness were a time of testing and transformation. The Hebrews entered as a people who had known only slavery, but they emerged with a new identity as a nation bound by covenant, faith, and law. Their story of deliverance became a central memory, shaping their understanding of who they were and who they were called to be. Out of bondage came freedom, and out of wandering came hope. With the wilderness years behind them, the Hebrews stood at the edge of the land that had long been promised to their ancestors. Under the leadership of Joshua, the faithful successor of Moses, they prepared to cross into Canaan. This was not merely a new chapter of their journey, but the beginning of their life as a people with a home of their own. The conquest of Canaan was filled with both triumphs and struggles. The city of Jericho became the most memorable symbol of this era. According to tradition, the Hebrews marched around its walls for 7 days, carrying the Ark of the Covenant and blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, the walls fell, and the city was taken. Other battles followed as Joshua led the tribes to claim their inheritance. Yet the conquest was not complete or easy. The land remained shared with Canaanite peoples, and the Hebrews often had to adapt, settle, and negotiate rather than conquer outright. When the campaigns ended, the land was divided among the 12 tribes of Israel. Each tribe received its territory, from the lush valleys to the rocky highlands, from the fertile plains to the arid deserts. The people no longer wandered as nomads, but began to establish villages, farms, and towns. Life became more settled, yet with settlement came new challenges. Without a central ruler, the tribes often struggled with unity, relying on local leaders and their own strength. This period became known as the time of the judges. The judges were not kings, but charismatic leaders raised up in moments of crisis. They acted as military commanders, mediators, and sometimes spiritual guides. Among them was Deborah, a prophetess and warrior who inspired her people to victory against powerful enemies. Gideon, another judge, began as a hesitant man but grew into a leader who defeated the Midianites with a small band of soldiers, proving that faith and courage could overcome great odds. Samson became perhaps the most legendary of the judges. Known for his extraordinary strength, he fought the Philistines, though his personal struggles and flaws ultimately brought him to a tragic end. The time of the judges was marked by cycles of faith and failure. The Hebrews would turn from their covenant, face oppression from neighbors, cry out in despair, and then be delivered by a leader raised by God. These cycles revealed both the resilience of the people and the fragility of their unity. Without strong central leadership, they were vulnerable to both internal division and external threats. In time, the people began to demand a king, They wanted a leader who could unify the tribes and protect them from enemies such as the Philistines, who pressed upon their borders with iron weapons and organized armies. The prophet Samuel warned them that kingship would bring burdens, taxes, and the risk of corruption, yet the people insisted, and so the first king of Israel was chosen. His name was Saul. Saul began his reign with promise. Tall and commanding, he rallied the tribes and won victories against their enemies. For a time, it seemed that Israel had found the unity it long desired. Yet Saul's reign was troubled by insecurity and disobedience. He grew jealous, suspicious, and at odds with Samuel, who had once anointed him. Into this turbulent court stepped a young shepherd named David. David first appeared as a musician, soothing Saul with his harp. Soon he revealed himself as a warrior, defeating the Philistine giant Goliath with only a sling and a stone. His courage and faith made him beloved among the people, but it also stirred Saul's jealousy. David endured years of pursuit and hardship, hiding in caves and gathering a band of loyal followers. Eventually, after Saul's tragic death in battle, David became king. David's reign transformed Israel. He united the tribes, defeated enemies, and established Jerusalem as his capital. He brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city, making it the spiritual heart of the nation. Beyond his victories, David was remembered for his psalms, songs of praise, lament, and hope that gave voice to the soul of his people. His life was marked by both greatness and personal failings, yet his legacy endured as the model of a king chosen by God. After David came his son Solomon, whose reign is remembered as a time of wealth, wisdom, and splendor. Solomon expanded the kingdom, built alliances through marriage, and fostered trade with distant lands. His greatest achievement was the building of the Temple in Jerusalem, a magnificent house of worship where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. The Temple became the central symbol of Hebrew faith, a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. Solomon was famed for his wisdom, and stories of his judgments spread far beyond Israel. The period of David and Solomon became the golden age of the united monarchy. Israel reached a height of power and stability that was never again fully matched. For the Hebrews, this era represented the fulfillment of the promises first given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had a land, a kingdom, and a place to worship their God. Though challenges lay ahead, the memory of this golden age would remain, a beacon for generations, a vision of what the people could be when united in faith and purpose. The golden age of Israel reached its height under King Solomon, but with his death, the unity of the nation began to unravel. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and Solomon's many alliances had left resentment among the tribes. When his son Rehoboam ascended the throne, the northern tribes petitioned him for relief from these burdens. His refusal led to a breaking point. 10 tribes withdrew their loyalty and formed the northern kingdom, called Israel, while only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David, forming the southern kingdom of Judah. From that moment, 2 Hebrew kingdoms existed side by side. Israel, with its capital at Samaria, was larger and often wealthier due to fertile lands and trade routes. Judah, with Jerusalem as its center, was smaller but held the temple, which remained the heart of Hebrew worship. Although they shared a common ancestry, the 2 kingdoms frequently quarreled and even fought one another. The vision of unity under David and Solomon was lost, replaced by division and rivalry. Political instability plagued both kingdoms. In Israel, kings rose and fell quickly, often through assassination or rebellion. Dynasties were short-lived, and the throne passed from one ambitious leader to another. Judah was more stable, with the line of David continuing, yet its kings were not always wise or faithful. Both kingdoms faced the constant threat of powerful neighbors. To the north and east, Assyria expanded aggressively, building an empire that stretched across the Near East. To the south, Egypt still exerted influence, while smaller kingdoms such as Aram and Moab also posed threats. The Hebrews were often caught between these larger powers, forced to choose alliances that rarely brought lasting security. In the midst of this turmoil, voices arose that sought to remind the people of their covenant with God. These were the prophets, men who spoke not only of the future, but of the present moral and spiritual condition of the nation. Elijah, one of the greatest of them, challenged the worship of Baal in Israel and confronted kings with fearless words. He called the people back to faithfulness, insisting that the God of Israel alone was worthy of devotion. His successor, Elisha, continued this mission, performing signs and urging the people to turn from false gods. Other prophets followed in later generations. Amos, a shepherd from Judah, delivered fiery words against the injustices of Israel, condemning the exploitation of the poor and the corruption of the wealthy. Hosea used the imagery of a broken marriage to describe Israel's unfaithfulness to God, yet also spoke of divine love and forgiveness. In Judah, prophets such as Isaiah and Jeremiah carried the same burden. Isaiah spoke of hope, of a future where nations would stream to Jerusalem to learn the ways of peace. Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, warned of judgment while lamenting the stubbornness of his people. Through these prophets, the Hebrews were constantly reminded that their survival as a people did not depend only on armies or alliances, but on righteousness, justice, and faithfulness to their God. While the kings and prophets contended with matters of politics and faith, daily life continued for the ordinary Hebrews. Most lived as farmers, tending fields of wheat and barley, vineyards and olive groves. Shepherds guided flocks through the hills, while craftsmen worked with wood, stone, and metal in the towns. Festivals marked the rhythm of the year. Passover recalled the exodus from Egypt. The Feast of Weeks celebrated the harvest, while the Feast of Tabernacles reminded the people of their time in the wilderness. Family life centered on the home, where meals, prayers, and stories bound each generation to the traditions of the past. The temple in Jerusalem remained a sacred focus for Judah, while in Israel, local shrines and altars often became substitutes, sometimes drifting into practices that mixed Hebrew faith with Canaanite customs. This blending of beliefs led to deep spiritual struggles. Idolatry became a persistent temptation. Kings in both Israel and Judah at times tolerated or even encouraged the worship of foreign gods. Yet there were also movements of reform. Some kings, like Hezekiah and Josiah of Judah, sought to cleanse the land of idols and restore the centrality of the covenant and the temple. These reforms brought periods of renewal, though they were often short. The people frequently slipped back into old ways, drawn by the allure of surrounding cultures. As the years passed, the shadow of great empires grew darker. Assyria became a looming force that threatened the independence of both Israel and Judah. Eventually, the northern kingdom of Israel fell under Assyrian conquest. Its people were carried away, and the 10 tribes became known as the lost tribes of Israel. Judah survived for a time, but its survival was fragile, dependent on shifting alliances and uneasy tribute to powerful rulers. Behind Assyria rose Babylon, whose ambitions would soon reshape the fate of Judah as well. The period of division and decline revealed the vulnerability of the Hebrew people. when they strayed from unity and faithfulness. Yet even in this era of instability, the voices of the prophets kept alive a vision of justice, mercy, and hope. The daily lives of farmers, shepherds, and families carried forward traditions that would outlast kingdoms. Though the land was threatened, and the people often faltered, their story continued, preparing the way for the trials and the endurance that lay ahead. The decline of the Hebrew kingdoms reached its breaking point in the 8th century before the Common Era. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital at Samaria, faced the growing might of Assyria. Assyria was an empire built on conquest. Its armies feared for their discipline and cruelty. Year after year, its kings pressed outward, demanding tribute and submission from neighboring lands. Israel resisted, sometimes making alliances, sometimes rebelling, but in the end, the strength of Assyria proved overwhelming. In the year 722, the armies of Assyria besieged Samaria. After years of struggle, the walls fell, and the kingdom of Israel was destroyed. Many of its inhabitants were carried away into exile, scattered across the empire. Others were absorbed by neighboring peoples. The 10 northern tribes, once so central to the family of Jacob, became known as the lost tribes of Israel. Their identity faded into history, leaving Judah as the last remnant of the Hebrew kingdoms. For a time, Judah survived, protected by its walls and strengthened by reforming kings like Hezekiah and Josiah. It endured as a smaller but determined state, yet its survival was always fragile. Assyria eventually gave way to a new power rising in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians. Under their ambitious king Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon sought to dominate the lands of the Near East. Judah found itself trapped between competing empires, sometimes allying with Egypt, sometimes resisting Babylon, but never secure. In 586, the end came. Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded Jerusalem. The siege dragged on, bringing famine, fear, and despair. At last, the walls were breached. The temple, built by Solomon centuries before, was burned to the ground. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared from history, its fate a mystery that has never been solved. The city lay in ruins, and many of its inhabitants were taken in chains to Babylon. For the people of Judah, this was more than the loss of a capital. It was the destruction of the very center of their faith. Without the temple, where could they worship? Without the land, who were they as a people? The catastrophe of 586 marked one of the darkest moments in their history. Life in exile was filled with grief. By the rivers of Babylon, the captives sat and wept, remembering Zion. Families were uprooted, forced to live in foreign lands, surrounded by strange gods and customs. Yet even in their sorrow, they held on to their identity. They gathered in communities, preserved their traditions, and told their children the stories of Abraham, Moses, and David. The words of the prophets became a source of strength, reminding them that even in exile they were not abandoned. Ezekiel was among those taken to Babylon, and his visions brought both judgment and hope. He spoke of a valley of dry bones that came to life again, symbolizing that Israel, though broken, would one day be restored. Daniel, living in the courts of Babylon, gave witness to faithfulness in a foreign land, refusing to abandon his devotion even in the face of persecution. These prophetic voices reminded the exiles that their God was not bound to the temple or the land alone. He was present even in Babylon, guiding, watching, and promising a future. The Psalms of this period capture the anguish of the exiles. Some are filled with lament, crying out against suffering and loss. Others hold on to trust, declaring that, even in despair, God remains faithful. These songs were not only prayers but also a way of remembering. They carried the memory of Jerusalem in their melodies and the hope of return in their words. By repeating them, the exiles kept alive the vision of who they were and what they might become again. In exile, the Hebrews transformed. They became more than a kingdom. They became a people of faith bound together by memory, law, and tradition. The destruction of the temple forced them to reimagine worship, emphasizing prayer, scripture, and community. The land was lost, but their identity survived. What seemed like the end was in fact a turning point, shaping them into a people who could endure beyond borders and kingdoms. The story of conquest and exile is one of tragedy, yet it is also one of resilience. Out of ruin came renewal. The lost tribes of Israel faded, but the people of Judah carried forward their faith. Their tears by the rivers of Babylon became seeds of hope, for in time they would return. Prophets and psalms promised that exile was not forever. The memory of Jerusalem and the covenant of their God kept them alive. Though scattered and broken, they were not defeated. From the ashes of destruction, the hope of restoration continued to shine. After decades of sorrow in Babylon, a new chapter opened for the Hebrew people. Babylon, once the great power of the Near East, fell to the rising empire of Persia under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. Unlike previous conquerors, Cyrus adopted a policy of tolerance toward the many peoples under his rule. In the year 539 before the Common Era, he issued a decree that allowed the Hebrews to return to their homeland and rebuild what had been lost. For the exiles who had long wept by the rivers of Babylon, this decree was nothing less than a miracle. The return to Jerusalem was both joyful and difficult. Many families had been born in exile and had never seen the land of their ancestors. They faced the long journey home, traveling with hope, yet also with uncertainty. When they arrived, they found a city still scarred by destruction and a land that had been altered by years of neglect and occupation. The Temple of Solomon, once the pride of the nation, lay in ruins. The task of rebuilding was immense. Despite these challenges, the Hebrews began the work of restoration. Under leaders such as Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah the governor, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and laid the foundations of a new temple. This second temple, though humbler than Solomon's grand structure, became the spiritual center of their renewed identity. It was not only a place of worship, but also a sign that the covenant still endured. Sacrifices resumed, festivals were observed once more, and the rhythms of faith were restored to the land. The return, however, was not without struggle. The people faced opposition from neighboring groups who resisted their rebuilding efforts. Poverty and hardship weighed heavily on the community, and questions arose about how to remain faithful in a world that had changed so much. Ezra and Nehemiah guided the people not only in practical matters of rebuilding, but also in spiritual renewal. They emphasized the importance of the law, the Torah, as the foundation of the people's identity. Public readings of the scriptures were held, reminding the people of their history and covenant. In this way, the Hebrews began to shift from being defined primarily by kings and kingdoms to being defined by their sacred texts and traditions. This transformation was profound. The exile had taught them that their God was not bound to a land or a temple alone. In Babylon, they had survived without these things by turning to prayer, scripture, and community. Now, even with the temple restored, they continued to place emphasis on the written word, on teaching, and on preserving their traditions. They became known as the people of the book, a community whose identity rested on memory, law, and faith, rather than on political power. The preservation of scriptures, during and after this period, became one of their greatest achievements. Stories of creation, the patriarchs, the Exodus, and the kings were gathered, shaped, and written down. The words of the prophets, the psalms of lament and praise, and the wisdom of sages were recorded and treasured. These writings not only kept alive the memory of the past, but also provided guidance for the future. They gave the Hebrews a shared identity that could withstand exile, conquest, and dispersion. The influence of the Hebrews did not end with their own people. Their faith gave rise to Judaism, the religion that carried forward the traditions of the Torah, the prophets, and the law. In time, their scriptures and ideas became the foundation for Christianity, which spread across the Roman Empire and beyond. Later, Islam would also draw from the stories and figures of the Hebrew tradition, recognizing Abraham, Moses, and the prophets as part of its own spiritual heritage. From a small people who began as wandering shepherds, an immense legacy was born that shaped the spiritual imagination of much of the world. The story of the ancient Hebrews is therefore more than a tale of one nation. It is the story of how faith, memory, and resilience can carry a people through the rise and fall of empires. They were never the mightiest of kingdoms, nor did they build the largest cities or conquer vast territories. Yet through their devotion to their God, through the preservation of their scriptures, and through their vision of justice and mercy, they influence countless generations as we reflect on their journey, from Abraham's call to Moses' leadership, from the rise of kings to the sorrow of exile, and finally to the restoration under Persia. We see a thread of endurance that binds it all together. The Hebrews began as a small family and became a people whose ideas reached across time and continents. Their legacy endures in synagogues, churches, and mosques, in prayers whispered by millions, and in the timeless hope that faith can carry humanity through every trial.